So today we have Therese Jones, and I'm really excited to welcome you. I think that we've had a lot of data science-y type people visiting for the last 3 sessions. And Therese is the Senior Director of Policy at the Satellite Industry Association. That's SIA, right? That's the acronym. And I'm really excited for everything you are willing to talk to us about today. So go ahead and introduce yourself in whatever way you desire.
Okay, so brief overview. I'm currently the Senior Director of Policy at the Satellite Industry Association. We represent over 50 different space companies. So from your major geostationary satellite operators to the manufacturers like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Airbus, some launch companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Amazon's now a member, different remote sensing companies. Planet is one you might have heard of. And I'm effectively the industry liaison to the federal government, and I'll talk more about what my job's like day to day later. But how did I get here from astronomy? I was in Berkeley's astronomy PhD program, and I was sort of midway through grad school. This was during the last recession, and the job market prospects were looking pretty bad in academia. Like most of the Berkeley postdocs weren't getting faculty jobs. I also realized that I wasn't super happy programming all day, every day. I mean, I certainly liked programming to some extent, just not staring at a computer screen all the time, and certainly felt like my research was getting really narrow. So I took this, I had been thinking about doing policy for a little while, but I didn't really know how to get into it. There's an AAAS sort of career personality test that I think is still online that I took, and policy came up as my top thing. And they ended up listing a bunch of science policy PhD programs, which I didn't even know existed. So I switched programs and started a policy PhD at RAND. RAND is a nonpartisan research institution. They're actually the oldest PhD granting institution for public policy in the US. They started right after World War II because General MacArthur thought there were too many brilliant minds going back into academia and wanted them to do work for the Air Force. They're based in Santa Monica because a lot of aerospace manufacturing happens there. But since then, they've expanded to do all realms of policy. So about 50% is somehow defense related. The other parts are education policy, healthcare policy, just really spanning all realms of policy. Again, nonpartisan. A lot of people think it's associated with ANRAN somehow, no connection. It's a terrible acronym that stands for research and development. But how they work, it was a weird PhD program in that I was effectively employed by RAND while doing my PhD and was treated like any other researcher. So I would go around to different PIs within RAND, and they have over 500 research employees, probably a lot more than that now. They've been expanding rapidly recently. And you just go around, talk to PIs, see where you fit on projects, and I'd end up working on 5 different projects at once. I did also have to take classes there, but was more or less treated as a researcher, just not working 100% time since I was also doing classes and my own dissertation research. In terms of their funding, about 50% comes from the federal government in congressional budget lines. They have 4 federally funded research and development centers, and I'll talk more about some other FFRDCs later. But they have 1 for the Air Force, 1 for the Army, 1 for DoD, and 1 for DHS. And this is where a lot of their space work falls. It's not necessarily super defense oriented, it's just that's where there's a lot of government money to go into the space industry. And the projects that I worked on, even though they were policy, could be very technical at times. So I did an analysis at one point that DoD asked us to do because they were thinking about putting a GPS payload on a Japanese satellite. And they sort of wanted a technical overview of what the future of global navigation satellite systems, GNSS satellites, so the broader international GPS, looks like over the next 10 years, and what different coverage scenarios look like if some of these satellites go out. So that in part was a bunch of different simulations I was doing, and that was all coding, and I had a great time doing that. But also talking to DoD about what the policy implications were of these different decisions they could make about, do you use the Japanese, what it looks like if you're, working with Europe, things like that. So that was one of the more technical projects I was on. Did a lot of projects that were looking at new space companies and what sort of investments the government should make or what sort of services they should buy. There was another fun remote sensing project that I would say was really technical but all qualitative, just to give you an idea of the diversity of projects that existed, where we were asked to evaluate potential new remote sensing architectures and, again, what the government should be investing in. We had to talk with very high-level stakeholders across the federal government about how they use remote sensing products, and then infer from that and what their future needs would be, what the technological needs would be. So we were talking to like 3-star generals or very high people in the State Department about how they use remote sensing data in international negotiations, and then having to port that very qualitative information into technical policy recommendations. And overall, that was a really great experience for me. I got to do things like I briefed the former Secretary of Homeland Security on a cybersecurity project while I was there, and it's pretty unheard of for a grad student. If you're interested in full-time employment, they definitely do hire a lot of physical science PhDs. They hire people from a bunch of different disciplines. So one thing I liked about working there was, on a lot of these space projects, there were obviously a lot of scientists and engineers, but would also end up working with economists or even like anthropologists on some of these different projects. And I should say, for a lot of the more science and technology oriented projects, because their funding is from the federal government, you generally do have to be a US citizen to be part of a lot of them, especially the space-oriented ones. But overall, they do hire people who are international as well. Just, you would probably end up working on a different set of projects. There are a bunch of other federally funded research and development centers too, which some people might be interested in working for. Some are more policy-oriented, some are more engineering-oriented. Aerospace Corporation is one of them. Oh, I should mention RAND has a bunch of different offices before I move off of RAND. They've got one in Santa Monica. They've got another big one in DC. They have a smaller office in Boston, but I know it's growing a lot, so something that you may want to look into if you're staying in Boston. They've got one in Pittsburgh. They've got international offices in Cambridge, and I want to say they have one in Belgium and Australia. I might be missing one or two, but they are over a wide range of places, and they try to make it generally so that if you're hired by them, you can work at any of at least the US offices. Aerospace Corporation's another FFRDC. They do a lot of engineering work. You may have heard of them. They also are down in Southern California, and they also have a big office out in Chantilly in the DC area. Then they've got some other sites in Colorado, which I think is going to be growing a lot because of the Space Force, and I'll talk more about that later. I think they've got one in New Mexico. But yeah, they do a lot of engineering work. They also have a decent sized policy center if you're interested in more policy efforts. MITRE is another more engineering type FFRDC that does hire a lot of physicists. They do a lot of space work, some with policy implications, but more on the technical side. The Institute for Defense Analysis, IDA, is another one. They're known for hiring physicists, so something to look into. They house the Science and Technology Policy Institute, which is an FFRDC for the White House Offices of Science and Technology Policy. So they have been very active in doing space work recently, just because this administration has been very space focused. That's another place to look. How did I end up at this job that I'm currently in? As I was wrapping up my PhD, I had to start out in the RAND Santa Monica office. I moved over to DC because I knew that's where most of the policy jobs I was interested in were. So decided to switch offices, work on my dissertation work and project work from out here, and really just went to every space industry event possible that I could while I was here. There are a ton of free events in DC, lots of free ones online now, and I know some of these events are, popping up too. I was supposed to be up there for Harvard MIT Space Week, but that was the week everything shut down. So I know some things are in your area too. But in general, I found the space industry is really inviting, and people are really willing to sit down and talk to you about their careers and try to help you out. It just generally takes, trying to reach out and talk to people, and they're generally very helpful. I've found in talking to astronomers in the past, they often just put in applications at companies when it really does help to have that connection, but people in the space industry are more than willing to help you out and introduce you to people too. So I was here working on my PhD. I was sort of selectively applying. A friend of mine who I met from going to all these space events told me about this job that had opened up that she was actually second in line for the last time it was open. And so I ended up applying. It was a really good fit. So at the Satellite Industry Association, I work on all the same different policy areas that I was working on previously, like GPS policy, communication satellites, remote sensing. And I'm sort of the industry liaison for the federal government. So anytime the government wants to put out a new regulation about space, we have to come up with a consensus position on that. And it's difficult to get all 50 companies to agree on things. So there's a lot of negotiating back and forth and working on language. I primarily work with our member companies' lawyers now. So it's a bit of a shift from working on the more technical policy projects to working with primarily lawyers. So we definitely have technical people from the companies come in on some of the more technical policy problems. But it's been very helpful to have a technical background because, as you can imagine, a lot of these issues, things like working on orbital debris, really does require technical experts to come in and be part of the policy conversation. A lot of the work that we do is with the FCC on spectrum management related issues. And that's certainly an area that needs more people who have things like radio astronomy experience. And the FCC is also working on orbital debris related issues, so we interface with them a lot. NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, is sort of the government version of the FCC. They do all the licensing for any sort of government applications that use spectrum. So dealing with the FCC and NTIA and getting them to have a common vision on space issues is definitely something that we're working on. Work with NOAA because they do remote sensing licensing. There's a revived Office of Space Commerce that's in the Department of Commerce right now that they're trying to elevate to be directly under the secretary level. It's trying to promote the space industry, but is also working a lot on this orbital debris issue, and was assigned by the White House Space Policy Directive 3 a year or so ago to create an open architecture data repository of data about space situational awareness and orbital debris. So there's going to be a lot of effort working on that in the future, and another place where astronomers can probably plug in with all of the orbital dynamics work and monitoring work that's going on. Additionally, working with the National Space Council a lot, which was revived under this administration and covers a bunch of different government agencies, from Commerce to State Department to Department of Energy's in it now, DoD obviously, DHS, NASA is represented, so a bunch of different stakeholders. We're also often asked for feedback on legislation that's space related. So we might get a draft of a bill from the Hill and ask how it impacts the satellite industry and if we have any recommendations, because generally they want to make sure that any regulations that are created don't significantly harm U.S. industry. And also work with other government agencies on space technologies like DoD, NASA, and just kind of letting them know what's out there. it's been a really great opportunity to be able to work with all these different stakeholders, and it's very different from working at RAND, where the reports were sort of on a year, generally on a year timeline. Occasionally they'd be faster, but that was more of an academic, research type role, although they had very hard deadlines, unlike academia where you keep revising. Versus now, a lot of the efforts are very quick, and you can kind of immediately see the impact. And also in this role, we're US focused, but do work on international levels. It's on the international level to some extent. I've worked with the State Department to present different industry positions, particularly on orbital debris, and share information with international delegations at the UN level. So there's a UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and work with them a lot on space sustainability. And in general, do a lot of outreach to try and encourage people to be good actors in space. What else did I want to cover? Let's see. I found that work-life balance in general in the space industry has been better in many regards than academia. Unless you're at a space startup and probably working startup hours, I think a lot of people's jobs, are much more confined to a 40-ish hour work week. My job being in a nonprofit is nice in that we get far more vacation than average Americans and federal holidays off and things like that. The other advantage, well, I found it an advantage to being in the space industry, is that most of the jobs are in major cities where I would find it ideal to live. So lots of DC area jobs. Boston is growing a bit, though not quite as many jobs up there. Both Bay Area and Southern California are big hubs. Seattle's a big hub. Colorado's a huge hub, and will be growing because of the Space Force. And then decent number of jobs in Texas and Florida too, to support, NASA Johnson and NASA Kennedy. So it's just something that I was thinking about in quality of life if I wanted to be in academia, that I wasn't sure I wanted to be in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota for, the only permanent job I could get, and wanted to be in a major city. I think that's, I did want to mention in terms of areas where there are going to be a bunch of space industry jobs. I'm sure you know that the number of satellites going up into space is growing, especially with the Starlink astronomy issues with light pollution. Right now, I want to say we're at about 2,500 active satellites on orbit, but over the next 10 years, there are licenses for over 100,000. I don't think all of those will end up going up by any means, but that's just to say the industry is growing a lot. So there will continue to be a lot of jobs. I don't think we've been really heavily, we've been impacted by COVID to some extent, but I think not nearly as much as the rest of the economy, just because defense jobs are considered critical infrastructure. For the communications companies, they are also considered critical infrastructure because a lot of them are providing things like satellite internet to remote areas of the country that otherwise wouldn't be connected. And remote sensing companies are certainly being still heavily utilized by the US government. There are companies that are definitely hiring very heavily, both on the communications satellite front. Amazon is launching their own communication satellite constellation called Kuiper, and I know they're hiring heavily with that. And Amazon Web Services just announced today a branch of AWS that is specifically focusing on space services. So if you're, again, more of a computational person, something you might want to look into. Remote sensing, the data analytics companies are growing dramatically. And I would say for remote, if you're not a US citizen, I would definitely look more at the data analytics portion of the industry, whether that's, AWS or on the remote sensing downstream application side. There is a ton of money going into that industry, particularly from agriculture and then oil and mining right now to do monitoring. So a lot of the work is government, but they do have a very substantial sector that's outside of government as well. And One more area that is going to be growing a lot, there are companies that have gotten contracts from NASA to support the the return to the moon by, in theory, 2024. And companies that have gotten contracts through that are Jeff Bezos' company, Blue Origin, SpaceX, Dynetics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Draper. So those are all companies that are probably going to be hiring a lot over the next few years. I think that was my overview. I'm happy to answer any questions about this, space careers in general, how to get involved in the space industry, or anything you want to know about the space industry.
That was great. Thank you for a really thorough intro. I feel like you've done a lot and can answer questions in like a huge variety of topics. So if you have a question, you can either type it in the chat window or raise your hand and I will call on you. Otherwise, I can kick off the first question. I think that you mentioned you work with students a fair amount and helping students figure out, you know, maybe like which industry they should land in. And I'm assuming these are undergraduate students, is that right?
A lot of grad students too, because I mean, I think a lot of people end up in the space industry after exploring other fields and don't really know what exists. So done a lot of work with both undergrads and grad students. I'm going to post a link of information I compiled for students and young professionals to help get into the space industry. But if
wow.
you're
Go ahead. This is great. Everyone should go to this link right now.
If you're still a student, there's an organization called Students for the Exploration and Development of Space that, you know, really have chapters across the country and actually across the world, focused on helping get students into the space industry. They have things like they do rocketry competitions. Some of the chapters are building CubeSats. They have an annual conference called Space Vision that's really great. If you are still a young professional, which is defined as 35 and under, there's also an international organization called the Space Generation Advisory Council that does a bunch of events worldwide to promote students and young professionals in the space industry. They have a lot of online events, and they also have a decent number of in-person ones in the US too. And it's free to sign up. If you sign up for their email list, you'll be informed about all of their opportunities. In terms of other things in that list, since there are a lot of virtual events right now, I'd recommend going to, it's in the Google Doc, but spacepolicyonline.com is probably the best industry events calendar. And there are multiple webinars a week going on right now if there's anything in the space industry that's of interest to you.
I was also going to ask about maybe if you had any advice for students of like which courses they should take or what skills they should maybe work on if they're thinking about a career outside of academia in policy or the space industry in general.
Yeah, I mean, for the space industry in general, if you want to go into more of the engineering side, I would definitely recommend trying to get experience on hardware. That's very valuable, whether it's, you know, formally in an astronomy lab or finding a student organization that's doing a project related to hardware. A lot of students are getting experience building CubeSats right now. I don't know if there are any efforts like that at Harvard. I'm sure there's something similar. If you're interested in policy, I wouldn't say the coursework is necessarily as important as just getting plugged into the organizations that I have listed in the document and just going to as many of the virtual events as possible. And then there are a bunch of events in DC in particular that are also listed there that are cheap or free for students and young professionals. So if you have the opportunity to come down to DC for some of these different events, for instance, there's a satellite conference every year in March in DC for a week. And while the overall conference isn't free, the exhibit hall is free to access. They have given out some free student passes to the entire conference through the Students for the Exploration and Development of Space before, but it's just a really good way to meet people. There are often a lot of side events going on, and it's a really good way to get plugged in what's going on overall.
Cool. Let's go to Theron. And correct me, please, if I'm saying your name wrong.
You got my name perfect. Thanks.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Teresa. Therese. So yeah, my question is, I guess, so this sounds really exciting to me, and it's like something I like to consider when I started. So I'm going to graduate in the summer of 2021. So I'm like considering applying to the job like this this coming fall. But I guess there's like I have some hesitation in that I'm really not sure how much what sort of skill set, or like how much of a certain particular skill I need to have going into an application, and then like moreover, like how much on-job training is required and things like that to sort of bring you up to speed to like the type of work you're doing.
I mean, I think a lot of companies do expect that you will get a lot of on-the-job training, and it's more like looking at your problem-solving skills. If you're doing something that's more programming oriented, I think most astronomers have a great background in that already. I mean, on the engineering side, if you were doing hardware, they'd probably want you to have some hardware experience, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be a lot.
How does maybe like putting together a resume differ from an academic CV in the cases of some of these jobs?
That's a very good question. It definitely should be shorter. They don't really care about publications. They more want to see that you have experience working in teams, and the exact skills that map to the job. If you go into the details about your research, they will definitely get lost. So focus on the hard skills that you have versus your research experience.
Do not list all your papers, in other words. Okay, John Raymond is next.
Hi, I just wanted to mention another pathway if you're interested in policy. There was a guy who worked on a satellite project that I was involved in who got a job as a staffer on Capitol Hill for a senator. And then he came back to the satellite project for a couple of years, but fairly quickly moved on to government liaison with the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. And now I think he's doing something in the solar power industry similar to that.
Yeah, and in the Google Doc, there's a list of policy fellowships as well, which are a good avenue if you want to go the policy route, which includes some of the congressional ones. So I know a lot of people from astronomy that have been a Hill staffer for a year and then have gotten space industry jobs afterward.
Okay, let's go to Rainer.
Hi, yeah, thanks for taking the time. I have a general question about the industry, I would say. Where does the money come from, like percentage-wise? How much of it is government money? How much is private or company money? And how do you expect this to evolve?
Yeah, so it's becoming less and less government funding because the commercial space industry is finding a lot of new revenue generating streams just by creating these new technologies. Like for the remote sensing industry, there's a company called Planet that can take 1 meter images of the entire Earth every day. So they like to say they can count every tree on the planet every day. But they, when they were first starting, really thought they were mostly going to get government money for this project. And it turns out that 2/3 of their business is in agriculture. So the revenue streams in remote sensing, I would say, are primarily not government, although government still is one of the biggest. I mean, I guess they would be the biggest individual buyer of remote sensing data. On the communication satellite side, well, those actually the primary revenue stream in those is from things like satellite TV. So that's a huge segment of the industry in itself. But in terms of things like internet, it's definitely becoming a bigger and bigger commercial sector because they're providing connectivity on planes and on ships. and then hopefully being able to connect everyone on the entire planet. That's in theory the goal of SpaceX, and then Amazon's Kuiper project, and another company called OneWeb, which unfortunately filed for bankruptcy. That was sort of COVID related, but they're in the process of having taking bids for someone to pick up their assets. So we'll see what happens with them. But yeah, I would say the commercial side is growing quite a bit, and will probably continue to do so.
I was wondering, since we have no more hands, I'll just jump in with another question. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe like the details of your day-to-day work, like what are you doing on a daily basis and what does that look like? I know that's important for some people to consider as well.
Yeah, for me, my days vary quite a bit, depending on what different policy issues are going on. So I may be meeting with working groups to try and come up with compromises on different policy positions. For instance, the FCC back in April released early a draft. Well, they thought it was a final draft of new rules related to orbital debris, and they have this sunshine period before they have a meeting where they vote on these rules, where you can give comments, and there's a hard cutoff. But we had under 2 weeks, I think, from when they released this to come up with a policy position on it. Because things that they put in the draft came out of left field and had no technical basis. Effectively, one of the things that they put in these rules, for instance, was that all satellites above 400 kilometers had to be maneuverable, and like indicating that they would need to have some sort of propulsion on board. And that eliminates the entire CubeSat industry. So this was a really rapid response, and we probably had 10 meetings over the course of 2 weeks to try and come up with a policy position everyone agreed on, and then also had to meet with there are 5 different commissioners at the FCC, so had to meet with all of those offices, and then some of the other related offices in the federal government to explain our policy positions. So that's just an example of like a really compressed timeline. But we're normally working on quite a few different policy issues at once. So I might have like smaller group meetings to draft different documents with all of our member companies, and might have them about 10 different policy issues over the course of the week. A lot of it, and I do some of the drafting, certainly, but a lot of it's trying to get everyone to come to a consensus. Do meet with a lot of government officials. Sometimes that's on a particular policy issue. Sometimes it's more educational, going in and talking to different congressional staff about how space impacts people in their district. So I think those are the primary areas, and then there's an educational component to the public as well, where we're asked to talk to people in a wide variety of settings, both national and international.
Wow, lots more people-to-people contact, it sounds like. Many meetings. I guess a lot of astronomers do that as well, though, depending on what collaborations you're in. Chriselle.
Hi, Therese. Thank you so much for the Google Doc and sharing this experience with us. I was wondering if you could talk more about like the average salary of somebody working in policy, and how much travel do you have to do, since you have to meet with a lot of people, stakeholders?
I don't definitively know what the average salary is in policy, but I would say from people I've talked to, a lot of people who are a few years into their job are making at least $80,000 a year, and that's like a very low nonprofit level salary. If you're at a company, you're probably going to be making 125 plus, I would say. So it can be better than a lot of academic positions. I'm not sure at the very high levels what people are making, but I'm sure it's substantially more. And then, Oh, in terms of travel, sorry, I almost forgot the question. I had been traveling once a month or once every 2 months or so. That's somewhat up to my discretion. It's usually, you know, I'm invited to speak at a conference on behalf of the industry, and so my boss will more or less leave it up to me if I want to go. I enjoy doing it, so often take up those offers. But because we're based in DC and similarly meeting many of the government organizations we work with, I mean, they're almost all in DC. So it's a lot of travel within DC or the greater DC area, but not as much outside of DC to meet particularly with government.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, I was going to speak on Space Force.
Yeah, ask that too. The question is, can you speak a little more on what you know about the Space Force?
Yes.
Kira.
So Space Force wasn't very well represented in the national media. It was something that people had talked about in some construct for a number of years. And it was a completely nonpartisan issue until very recently. The problem was that over 60 different government organizations across the across DoD and the intelligence community do space acquisitions, and none of them were talking to each other. So you have like 60 different organizations sort of working on the same thing, duplicating efforts. Like one of my projects when I was still at RAND was effectively telling the Army what the Air Force was doing in space, because the Army launches its own satellites, and they're also the biggest user of space because all of their troops on the ground, you know, have devices that rely on satellite communications, they rely on GPS, and obviously use remote sensing for decision making. But sort of like, why am I getting paid to tell the Army what the Air Force is doing when they're both in DoD? So people had talked about trying to find ways to streamline all of this somehow and put everyone who was working on space in the same place. And I actually almost got hired on the Democratic side of the House to work on this, to show you that it really was a nonpartisan effort. They ended up needing a nuclear person instead, so that didn't end up happening, but there was a lot of nonpartisan discussion about it. And then what happened was first they created Space Command, which there are different combatant commands across the military. Some are geographically focused and some are focused on specific areas, like there's a cyber command focused on cybersecurity. And that was in theory a way to unite people working on space. But then this administration went one step forward and decided they didn't think that crosstalk was enough, and wanted to put everyone working on space in the Space Force, in part, you know, again, to not duplicate these acquisition efforts, but also in part to ensure that everyone was trained in space, in, you know, things like satellite operations and building satellites, because right now, a lot of people in the Air Force just sort of accidentally end up in space. They wanted to be a pilot, and then, you know, there's not really a specialized career track, and then they just end up in it. So it was more developing, you know, a cohort of people who had experience in the industry, especially because we're becoming increasingly reliant on space assets, and there's an increasing threat to space assets too, particularly cyber attacks on space systems. And, you know, there were studies that show, like, if we go a month without GPS, I think that would cost 1.4 trillion to the US economy. So this is sort of where Space Force is coming from. Nowhere in the initial discussions about Space Force did it talk about having like Jedi, US Jedi, even though that's sort of what the media portrayed it to be. But they're really starting to ramp up this effort now, and they're going to be based in Colorado Springs. There's already a lot of space stuff in Colorado Springs. So if you're interested in living in Colorado, there should be a lot of space-related job opportunities there in the future.
That was great. Thank you. Have you seen the new Netflix special?
I have. I think it's pretty funny. I mean, and there are a lot of things that I can relate to being a space industry person. Even government people I know think it's funny. So, I mean, like, detached from how the Space Force actually functions, but we appreciate the satire.
So it's like starting up, but like, is it like in the next few years they're going to be moving to Colorado Springs, or like what is the timeline for that?
Yeah, so they've already been moving personnel to Colorado Springs from, you know, positions largely in the Air Force that used to be working on space, but they're really going to be ramping up. You know, they've already started asking for people to transfer in the Space Force for other branches of the military, and are really ramping up the budget, and therefore, yeah, a bunch of contractors that are out there or civilian positions will be ramping up too for the next couple of years.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so interesting. I was in Colorado before I came here, and I feel like a lot of people that I'm thinking of contacting for this talk series are in Colorado doing jobs outside of academia, and like Ball Aerospace is there, like that kind of company, as well as the Air Force now and the Space Force. Chriselle, do you have another question? Otherwise, I will ask another. Okay, so I asked about the day-to-day. I asked about resumes. That's always my question, is like how to draft a resume, because I think that's so different than CVs. Looking at job ads. Oh, Theron, you should ask, because I'm just digging deep for a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I did have other questions, but I forgot about it to ask earlier. So is it common, would you say, to also reach out to like, yeah, here's the thing. Okay, so in like a company in industry, for example, you could conduct an informational interview, right? Like just by calling them. So I assume that might be different or not if you're working out of like a government agency, or like how do you kind of get in and like ask about like what's it like from someone who works at a specific place?
I highly recommend doing informational interviews, whether with people at companies or government. Federal government hiring is fun. So, I mean, for federal government hiring, generally, people within the agency don't, unless they're the hiring manager, don't have a lot of say in whether or not you get the job. USA Jobs is somewhat of a miserable process to go through. And a lot of organizations, particularly NASA, have moved to do like automated resume screenings. So you have to put in like all of the keywords that are in the job description. Otherwise, you won't, like a human won't even look at your application, which is not something I knew when I was applying for jobs out of grad school. And I wish someone had told me, because I wasted a bit of time on that. Also, some agencies, not NASA, make you do a skills survey, and you need to put that you're an expert for everything, even if you're not, in order to get through that step. Again, something I wish I knew. And some, particularly the non-technical positions, if you're going for an engineering position and you meet the you might be good if you meet the qualifications and move on to the next round. But I've also heard for non-technical positions, it's really hard to get one, especially within NASA, unless you are already in the federal government or you are a veteran, because there's substantial veteran preference. So I had there was an opening in NASA around the time I got this job. I knew a bunch of people who applied for it. Like, space policy community is pretty small. You would think I would know at least the people who are interviewed and probably the person who was hired. But because of this NASA screening, the top person, according to HR, was someone with zero space policy experience. They had veteran preference. But when asked why they wanted to do this international space policy position at NASA, they said they saw The Martian and it looked cool. So that's to say the federal hiring system, not always that great, if that's the avenue you want to go. Other agencies is probably a bit easier to get into. But yeah, going back to informational interviews, definitely recommend them. feel free to, like, if particularly reach out to me if there's any company you want to talk to. I probably know people there. Even cold messaging people on LinkedIn works. Yeah, I think informational interviews are the best way to go, particularly if there are a lot of events that you can attend related to the space industry. And people will tell you if they have jobs open at their company or not. Always follow up with an email. That's obvious to a lot of people, but I work with a lot of undergrads who forget about that component, thanking them for, you know, what they did, and mentioning a couple things that you discussed. But yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, let's go to Maurice.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I think maybe I missed something, but I don't think you mentioned, and I'm not saying you should have, but I'm surprised you didn't mention the CIA at all during this talk. And I like glanced through the Google Doc and I didn't see like their affiliation as well. Maybe I missed it at some point during the talk, but this is sort of like multiple questions in one. Are they very much involved in your work, or is it too much confidentiality issues, classified information? Satellites, I'd imagine, involve them, definitely, if they're counting when trees are born on a daily basis and things like that. So could you comment on classified information, satellites with CIA and things like that?
100%. I was lumping them into the intelligence community, and I realized I didn't talk about them that much. When I was at RAND, definitely our discussions on particularly remote sensing and that future remote sensing space architecture did involve talking to people at the CIA about how they use remote sensing data. So CIA is obviously a big user of remote sensing data, but the organizations that do the government acquisitions of remote sensing data and building of remote sensing satellites are the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So those also have a lot of jobs for technical people too. NGA has moved to be more focused on the internal government building of satellites and remote sensing satellites and more of the data analytics piece. And they're combined IC, DoD, and NRO has transitioned. I mean, they do work on the satellites going to space, but also working on commercial acquisitions of space data. So there are a lot of jobs both within those agencies and then for contractors that work with those agencies too.
When it comes to policy, directing policy on these issues, like I think you gave one example about launching an American satellite on a Japanese rocket. I think that was one example you gave. Do you have to often discuss sort of conflicts of interest or classified information with NRO, for example, or are there conflicts of interest like that specifically that you aren't even allowed to know what those conflicts are? They just tell you, hey, we can't do this. This policy can't go through.
There are definitely many policy issues surrounding that, both in terms of how the government functions and commercial satellites. So a big one that just sort of, is about to be fixed, hopefully, is they're modifying remote sensing licensing regulations. Even though you get a remote sensing license from NOAA, the license approval process went through an interagency group, which included the intelligence community, and the intelligence community could more or less veto a remote sensing license for any reason it wanted. I've heard of companies who submitted an application who waited over a year, didn't hear a thing back, and then the intelligence community just said no, and it turned out that they got a calculation wrong and misplaced a decimal point. But like, that's how opaque the process was. Now they're trying to create benchmarks by at least saying if this commercial remote sensing data is readily available in other countries, will fast track your license and approve you, because it was actually really harming the US space industry, because other countries were developing this technology since it was effectively made illegal in the US by the intelligence community. But also, I mean, even internally within the intelligence community, there are issues in trying to figure out how to best use commercial data, whether they get direct images from these commercial entities, how they integrate it into their work stream, if they can use these companies for doing their data analytics. I mean, they're so used to, NGA in particular is made up of all these analysts who spent many hours just staring at pictures. And obviously with machine learning, that is generally not an efficient way to go about using and aggregating remote sensing data anymore. So there are quite a few policy issues surrounding that.
Does that affect this is my last question. Does that affect your what's it called, credibility, or shall I say the office or agency that you work for? Are you all judged essentially, or do you receive a promotion based on how many policies you get through through the government, through the intelligence agencies? But if they make a mistake, or if they postpone, or if they delay, or if they veto, does that affect how you look as an employee or at your office? How are you all evaluated if it's not even your fault?
I mean, we're not directly evaluated on how many policies we're able to push through, but we certainly do try to make an effort to get people from both government and industry to sit down at a table and work through some of these issues, which I think is why some of this remote sensing reform ended up going through. I mean, there were a lot of people who'd been in the intelligence community and DoD for many years who were really against making any changes, but it took them realizing that other countries were developing these technologies faster than us, and realizing not only does that impact the US space economy, in all these companies directly, but it impacts the data that they're getting too, because they're becoming pretty reliant on the commercial space sector. So I wouldn't say that I'm judged if the policies don't go through, but we definitely have to make more of an effort if we're failing in some respects to get the government to sit down and understand these issues.
All right, thanks.
That was a really interesting line of questions. Thank you. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and we definitely are not going to end late. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? Yes, Jihan.
Hi, so I'm wondering, how many international people can be admitted to such jobs? Because it definitely sounds like this kind of job is a bit sensitive.
Yeah, so almost any space hardware job in the US is going to be restricted to US citizens because of ITAR, International Trafficking in Arms Regulations. I think there's some exposure to that in astronomy. I know that applies to things like working on gamma ray satellites too. I would say that the more downstream you're working, if you're working on data analytics, that's more open to international people. But the space sector had been really US focused for a long time, but it's really growing quite a bit internationally. I know Chinese government's putting a lot of money into it. The Japanese government's putting a lot of money into it, and new space startups. Both Luxembourg and the UAE have decided space are areas that they really want to invest in. I know UK as well is putting a lot of money into the space industry. So we're seeing companies pop up internationally that historically only would have been in the US with new space technologies. So I mean, I would say there are growing opportunities if you're not a US citizen, a lot of them in data analytics, but in these other countries as well.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds very reasonable.
Okay. Therese, you mentioned that you'd be willing to share your email. Does that still stand? I noticed it's on this document also, so if people still have access to the Google Doc. that's also on here. But if you have any follow-up questions, I'll just post it in here in the chat box. This has been really interesting, and I think this opens a lot of opportunities that are out there to people that maybe we weren't aware of. And I hope this was a good lunch break for everybody. Therese, do you have any last minute advice or words you want to end with?
I wanted to say, if anyone comes down to DC, when things are open again at some point, please let me know, and I'm happy to take you to space industry events and introduce you to people. I do this a lot with students and young professionals, or anyone who's interested in the space industry. So feel free to reach out to me at any time, either for that or making any connections if you want.
Awesome. Okay, so this is the last talk in the series for now. I need a little break on organizing it, but I'm going to start it up again in maybe a couple of months. And so if anyone has any suggestions for various career industries they want to hear from, send me an email, and or I will put together a nice little list of speakers for the next series. Cool. Thank you, everybody.